Welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Zoom on this beautiful October morning. Thanks for coming. I think most of you folks know me. My name is Jonathan Weber. I'm the Complete Streets Program Manager at Local Motion. I'm joined by Susan Grasso, who's our Complete Streets Program Associate. And Susan and I work together as a team to support folks who are working to make their communities better for walking and biking. That includes local advocates, it includes town staff. We also do a lot of advocacy at the local and state level. So we're really here to support folks like you. And one of the ways that we do that is through education and webinars like this one. And today we're going to be talking about some survey results that we gathered last year here in Chittenden County. Susan is going to be monitoring the chat for any questions, so feel free to post them or any comments that you have, and then also feel free to raise your hand if you would rather use your voice to ask a question. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in. So as I said, this is analysis of some survey data collected last year looking at active transportation trends in Chittenden County. The project team on this was myself and our intern, Carly. Carly did an awesome job taking all the data we had gathered and sort of making it all into this great presentation, which I think is a really nice product. So shout out to Carly for all of her work on this. So the purpose behind this survey was to capture key insights on public opinion and inform decisions regarding walk-bike policies, conditions, and improvements. Local Motion coordinated the survey. We had funding from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. Our staff drafted the survey questions with some help from our pollster, and we solicited input from a lot of stakeholders throughout the county. We also, the survey was administered by Embold Research, which is the nonpartisan unit of Change Research. A little more on the methodology. In total, it was a sample of 588 Chittenden County residents, and the survey itself was administered between August 31st and September 2nd. The margin of error is around 4.2%. And this was fielded on Facebook and Instagram. This is not a phone survey. That allows Change Research or Embold actually to adjust the demographics that they're serving the ads to for the survey as the results are coming in, so that they can reduce the need for waiting after all of the results are in. Political orientation was not accounted for in the sampling. Basically, the funding that we had from the Regional Planning Commission to allow us to do this can't be used for what's considered political research. So just be aware that political orientation and the differences in opinion on the questions in this survey and the differences in behavior that come with that, they're not sort of baked into the data here. Finally, the data was weighted, after everything was said and done, to depict the gender, age, race, ethnicity, and education of adults accurately in the county. So this presentation and the survey in general was sort of divvied up into three focus areas. We're going to start with the first, which is what are people's current transportation behaviors. So we're looking at how people get around, barriers to biking in particular, and then also barriers specifically to winter biking. So this presentation is going to be these three sections. We will stop after each one and take some questions and have some discussion because there's a lot of data and a lot of things to consider in each segment. So we'll jump right into current transportation behaviors. So I think most of us probably intuitively notice that most people in Chittenden County, sadly, are car dependent. They report driving as their primary mode of transportation. And the remaining 14 or so percent get around, 4% walk, and then between 3 and 1%, carpool, ride an e-bike or a bike. take the bus or ride a motorcycle. We do see that people of color, the lowest income group and the lowest age group, are generally twice as likely to carpool, bus, bike, or walk than the rest of the population. And that sort of data point and those demographics being more reliant and more interested in walking and biking is something that you're sort of going to see carried throughout this presentation. Looking at the same question in Burlington, so which transportation option do you use most often? We do see, a much lower percentage of people driving. So if you compare Burlington to the rest of the towns in the county, 75% of people in Burlington drive, as opposed to 90% of people in the towns outside of Burlington. And then the walk rate is much higher, 11%, as opposed to 1% in other towns. The bike rate is also almost double, although still just 5%. So this, of course, it suggests a lot of different things. I think the primary thing is, Burlington has the densest land use, the highest concentration of origins close to destinations, which just makes walking and biking much more convenient, much more doable for more people. I think it's likely that there is a similar effect within the other denser town centers throughout Chittenden County, but we're only splitting the data out for Burlington. So when we look at secondary modes of transportation, we asked people which other transportation options have you used in the past month, and they were able to select all that they had used. So 50% of people walked for transportation. 26% of people didn't really think they used any other mode of transportation. Of course, probably all of those people are also walking or rolling some way to get from their car to where they're going. A fifth of people biked or e-biked as a secondary mode, which is awesome. And then you had dropped off and carpool and the ride sharing after that. You may note that transit is not in the top 5 for secondary modes of transportation. However, 22% of people of color use the bus as a secondary form of transportation, as opposed to just 4% of white residents. So pretty big difference there. We also see that just an interesting data point, the lowest income group reported using the ride sharing apps actually the most frequently, over twice the rate of the middle and highest income groups. I think there are a couple different ways to explain that data point. One possibility is that that really represents students and sort of the younger population who are using it to go out on the weekends and get home safe. Another possible explanation is that lower income people who don't have a car, don't have access to someone who can give them a ride in a car, and are not served by the transit network or by the bike network, are really reliant on ride sharing when they need to get to a destination that's not within walking or biking or bus distance, which is of course a really expensive way to get around. So the next question we asked was, what prevents you from biking more often? So trying to get at these barriers that people experience that keep them from biking. And the number one that we saw was that their destinations are too far away. It just doesn't feel realistic to bike from my house to work or to where I go shopping. Number two, I don't own a bike. And then number three was the lack of safe bike infrastructure. And then there's sort of a handful of reasons beyond that, but those were the top 3. And this is throughout the county. We did see that women and people of color express a higher level of concern for safe bike infrastructure compared to men and white residents. So you can see that difference in that bottom left-hand corner there. And then again, sort of the comparison to Burlington, we see that destinations being too far away really drops off quite a bit. It's still one of the top 3 barriers, but it's not the top barrier. Instead, the top barrier in Burlington is actually a lack of bike ownership. And then lack of safe bike infrastructure is still the third here in Burlington. So I think, it really emphasizes again that importance of land use and helping our places develop with higher levels of density and more mixed use so that people can walk and bike to the places where they need to go, and those places are close enough for them to do that. I think it also highlights the importance of organizations like Old Folks Home that focus on getting bikes to people, as well as having a good regional bike share program. Finally, getting into winter biking. This was actually, I think, one of the most surprising and encouraging results in the survey. We asked people, how likely would you be to ride your bike for transportation in the winter if the streets had safe and well-maintained bike infrastructure? And we saw that people were about split on this. About half of people said they were very likely or somewhat likely to bike in the winter, and about half of people said they were very unlikely or somewhat unlikely. And personally, I would have expected the likely responses to be much lower than they were in this. So I thought this was really encouraging and a great indication that if we can make the investments in our bike infrastructure and do the maintenance to make sure it's really nice to ride in the winter, that people will use it. People are not afraid of being cold. This is Vermont, and they'll get out and bike as long as we make it reasonably nice to do so. So some key points from this first section, and if you've got questions, feel free to raise your hand or post them in the chat and we'll answer them. Number one, as we said, Chittenden County is mostly car dependent, but there's that comparatively lower rate of driving and higher rates of walking and biking in Burlington. Marginalized communities, people of color, lower income people are more likely to rely on forms of transportation other than driving. And finally, changes to land use, promoting more of that mixed use development, destinations near origins, initiatives that increase access to bikes, and improving infrastructure and winter maintenance are really key to addressing barriers to biking. So, do we have questions, comments, thoughts people want to share at this point? Susan, let's go to the chat first. I saw a couple things.
Yeah. So Will Dodge was asking about the timing of the survey and the fact that it was done in late summer. So with the questions asking about behaviors over the previous month, we can assume that this data really represents more summer riding. He didn't ask specifically about what we might expect the survey to say if it were conducted in the winter time, but maybe you want to speculate on that a bit.
Yeah. So the data, you can basically say that the data reflects behavior from August 2022. That's when we feel that it was at the end of August. So we asked about the past month. In terms of what it would have reflected in terms of the winter, if we had fielded this and asked the same question in the winter, I'm sure rates of biking would have been much lower during the winter. I think we all see that anecdotally, that there are fewer people riding. There are still a lot of people out that I see. And also, I think that that's changing as our winters sadly are becoming more mild. Personally, I know that I'm riding more frequently and not having to wear a snowsuit as frequently and hose my bike off as much. So I think that's changing, but I do think it would be lower if we had asked the same question in the winter. We have some hands up.
Yeah, no other questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands up.
I think I see that Phil has his. I'm gonna unmute you. So go ahead. Phil, if you've got a question, go ahead.
There we go.
There you are.
Because of my magnification, it took a while to find. all the way over on the right part of the screen. Jonathan, how much of this do you feel is a reflection of the lack of infrastructure money put into Burlington, Chittenden County, and the rest of the state? It seems that we put 90% into car-centric transportation, and whatever is left over, I think it's 2%, goes into transit, walking, and biking.
Yeah, I mean, I think has a huge effect on the data and on how people get around. You know, we saw, just for example, I'll flip back to this barriers question. We did see, you know, lack of safe bike infrastructure is a barrier for, you know, is sort of the number 3 barrier. So it's definitely up there. And if we were investing more in that infrastructure, I think there would also be stronger political support to maintain it. There would be a stronger bike culture. It would be more accepted. All kinds of things I think would sort of grow from that. So, and yeah, that the lack of funding is a key barrier to building more of the good infrastructure that we need. So yeah, I think that's definitely a huge component here.
So how can we make this more of, well, Locomotion and other groups working with active mobility? How can we better get this on the ballot so that we can increase the funding?
It is a priority for us. It's probably our top priority coming into this legislative session. One of the key sources of funding for bike and pedestrian infrastructure in Vermont is the state bike ped grant. And I just actually got the past 5 years of data on that. And over the past 5 years, it has only funded about 30% of the requests. So that's a lot of infrastructure that towns wanted to build that they haven't been able to over the past 5 years. I did see, I think our partners at the regional planning commissions also really want to see that increase. So yeah, it is a priority, and you know, for Locomotion, spending more time on lobbying is something that we are always trying to do. And if folks want to see us doing that, I would encourage you to donate, because we do need that kind of unrestricted grassroots donation in order for us to spend that time.
Well put. Thank you, Jonathan.
We also have a question from Will.
Let's see, Will, you should be able to chime in now.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for this survey. I think it's really great. I think it's a really good, you know, solid building block to start on. And I guess what I would encourage is, like, looking at this chart in particular, right? You know, it sort of goes to, well, what comes next? And obviously, sometimes I think, you know, some of these answers can be a little deceptive, because, for instance, I know that, like, some people who live in Essex, like I do, and commute into Burlington think, well, it's too far away. But what I've found over time with an e-bike is that, you know, my sort of average car commute takes about 25 minutes. And if I go in on an e-bike, I can get here in 35 minutes. And I would not have known that until I actually, like, started to get better at just navigating and kind of using the bike. So when I think about that, the convenience factor would change for me. And similarly with the bike infrastructure, I think it would be great if you guys had a survey that maybe got at, okay, well, what of the investments, of the public investments that could be made in bike infrastructure, what is the most, I don't know, requested? What's the most effective? Like, is it obviously, you know, dedicated multi-use paths like we have on Route 15 now? That made a huge difference for me. When I go to Montreal, I look with envy at those posts that can separate, the car paths from bike paths, or roads from the bike paths. So it'd be interesting to get more data about sort of like what would the commuter think if certain types of improvements were made. So anyway, that's more just a comment. I think it's a great, really great work that was done on this survey.
Yeah, thanks, Will. That is a great comment on the e-bike point. We will get to that a little later. We have a section on e-bikes that's going to be our third section, so we will get at that question of the effect on e-bikes to these barriers and how they're different for a person on an e-bike. Yeah, on the infrastructure point, totally agree with you. There's been a lot of great planning work done in the county. The Regional Planning Commission has an active transportation plan that was updated this year that does look at sort of what are the most effective, important segments to focus on. And then I would really encourage folks to check out actually the last webinar we did on level of traffic stress, which really gets at looking at like what is the appropriate kind of bike infrastructure given the context, the volumes and the speeds on the street. What does it take to really make a person feel comfortable? There's actually a pretty objective way to determine that using level of traffic stress. So Susan can probably put the link to that in the chat. So thanks, Will. And
we have I will put that link in just a minute. We don't have any other hands up. Stu, Lindsay makes the point though, related to this conversation about destination being too far indicates that housing near services is a key barrier. So that's a whole nother really important conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that land use question is really important, and I think a lot of municipalities, have a lot of work to do on that, and some are starting to do that work, and it's hugely important for getting more people walking and biking. I also saw Jean Bergman asked about us sharing this with the Transportation, Energy, and Utilities Committee of Burlington. I can't recall if I shared this with those folks specifically, but Jean, I absolutely will. And yeah, we are going to be sharing this more with elected folks in general. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving because we're almost halfway through already. So the second section gets into perspectives, basically asking people how they feel about this stuff, what their priorities are, what kinds of policies they would support, and what kinds of investments they want to see. So first off, we asked just generally, do you support or oppose your community increasing investment in biking and walking infrastructure? And really strong overall support for this at 67% throughout the county. And then on the right, again, you sort of see this pattern of people of color, Burlington residents, women, younger people in the lowest household income group having levels of support above the average throughout the county. So I think this is really encouraging that people want to see more of this stuff. They support their community spending more money and more capacity on it. This question is a little tricky. So this is basically trying to get at how people would position trade-offs between the types of transportation initiatives and investments we can make. This is based on a question that the Regional Planning Commission asks in its 5-year survey. We made some changes to how the options were described, and we got a very significant difference in our results from what the Regional Planning Commission had. Basically, in the Regional Planning Commission results, they tend to see safety ranked as number 1, and then I think preservation and walk-bike infrastructure as 2 and 3. You can see that what we got was preservation as number 1, but then we had efficiency and expansion, which essentially refer to building bigger roads or making traffic move more efficiently or more faster as 2 and 3. as you can see at the top, we provided quite a bit more description for those options in the Regional Planning Commission survey. It was not super clear what those were referring to. I think it was the right thing to do to provide more description for those options, but we did not provide more description for the other option, and I think that's part of why they didn't. Part of why the results were what they are for this question. So it'll be interesting to see what the Regional Planning Commission gets in terms of results to this in its next survey, which I think will go out this year. So keep an eye on that. So this, we asked basically your level of agreement for a statement, and the statement for this question was: investments in walking and biking infrastructure, such as sidewalks and bike lanes, would make our communities healthier and more enjoyable places to live. And we found that 73% of people agreed or somewhat agreed. So again, really strong support, pretty uncontroversial. We do see highest levels of support from Burlington residents, younger people, and women. Again, we asked people their level of agreement. The statement was that investments in walking and biking infrastructure are good for local business because they create more foot traffic, and 69% of people agree with this one. And again, highest levels of agreement from the lowest income group, youngest folks, and women. So, I think that this is really encouraging. People get the connection between the need to have people out of their cars, walking around, enjoying the built environment, in order for them to have successful businesses in their community. And that when you build a place just that's fast for cars to drive through, you're not creating an environment where local businesses are going to thrive. This was getting into basically how people would prioritize design elements when they're looking at a street that has businesses on it. So thinking about it like a main street or a commercial street. And we asked people to rank their priorities from 1 to 7. And basically what we saw was, of course, safety was number 1. That's not a huge surprise. People want to see everyone safe when they're interacting in a commercial business street. Number 2 was creating a place where people want to spend time and money. I think that's sort of similar to that last result, right? People think that it's important to get folks out of cars, make the public realm feel enjoyable and welcoming in order for business to be successful. Cost was number 3. They don't want to spend a ton of their tax money on it. And then parking for cars, unfortunately, still is number 4. So not a huge surprise to those of us who work on this kind of advocacy, that parking is still important to a lot of people. And then we have reducing delay for people driving, reducing delay for people walking and biking, and parking for bikes. So I think this kind of is about in line with what I tend to experience as an advocate, right? Like we see that people want the idea of safety, but that it sort of becomes a political fight once removing parking or increasing the cost of the project comes into the question. Also, I think interesting, the reducing delay for people walking and biking. I think people don't tend to think about, a signalized intersection where a person walking has to stop and wait as delay. I think that there's some work to do for us to emphasize that, people walking experience delay too, and that it would be, it's really important to reduce that to make walking much more convenient and easy to do. So another relatively uncontroversial one, we asked, do you support or oppose each of the following potential policies for your community? And this policy was adding more sidewalks and crosswalks. And 85% of people strongly or somewhat support this one. So there's not a whole lot to say about this. I think we all see this also, that sidewalks are pretty uncontroversial. And the struggle really is just to find the money to keep up with maintenance on them. So this is where we get a little more controversial when we start talking about protected bike lanes. We asked, do you support or oppose adding protected bike lanes to your community? 66% of people overall support, with 31% opposing. We see that women, people of color, the youngest age group, and the lowest income group have the highest levels of support. So I think that this was really encouraging. This question is just asking straight up, do you support adding protected bike lanes? People do want to see more protected bike infrastructure. It's where we get into the trade-offs that it gets more controversial when we see the support drop off. So we asked, would you support or oppose adding protected bike lanes to key roads in your community if doing so resulted in fewer parking spaces and or travel lanes for cars? So first off, we don't totally know if people are responding to the travel lanes or the parking removal, but that is something. I tend to think it's the parking. But we do see that only about 38% of people strongly or somewhat support this. And about 60% strongly or somewhat oppose adding protected bike lanes if it requires removing parking or travel lanes. We also see that people of color more strongly oppose this than white people, and we see that opposition actually increases as household income declines. So basically the lowest income group has the highest level of opposition to this. So it's, it conflicts with a lot of the other things that we see in the data in the survey, where those groups tend to be the strongest supporters of walking and biking, also have strongest levels of support for protected bike lanes in general. But when you frame it as a trade-off, that support drops off. So, I think it's instructive that, we do need to take care when we're looking at an impact like removing parking in particular. I think this also gets at the fact that we're in this sort of like halfway stage where we've built some of our bike infrastructure. We're getting to a point where we're having to make some harder choices about whether we're going to have parking on a street or a bike lane, but we haven't built out a cohesive network yet. And so when you remove parking on any one street, it doesn't necessarily feel like as much of a benefit as it would if the whole network outside of that street was already built up. So it's a bit of a transitional phase. I think there's work to do on messaging in terms of how, building out this network and getting more people biking, will reduce pressure on parking. Talking about how when you build infrastructure for cars, more people drive, more people need to park. So this is a really interesting result and something to keep in mind. So getting into some policies, we asked people if they support or oppose allowing people riding bikes to use pedestrian signals to cross intersections after coming to a complete stop and yielding to pedestrians. So basically this is, if you're on a bike coming up to a red light, you would stop, and then if the pedestrian signal comes on in your direction of travel, you're able to proceed through the intersection on the red light after you've yielded to pedestrians. And there's really strong support for this. This policy is already in place in Burlington. I think this is something that other municipalities should look at as well. On the other hand, people generally oppose what we call Idaho stop or stop as yield, which is giving people on bikes the right to treat stop signs as yield signs when there's no other traffic present. So 60% opposition to that. A few groups did have majority support, including people of color, those who report modes of transportation other than driving, and those who report biking and e-biking as a secondary mode. So I think this is, Idaho stop and stop as yield policies do have a pretty clear safety benefit. They've been implemented in quite a few states and a few municipalities at this point. So I think there's some education to be done on this one. So that's the end of our second section, and please do post your questions or raise your hand if you have a question. Just are going over our key points. Improving walk and biking infrastructure is broadly supported, but for a lot of folks, at least in our data, it isn't the highest priority, and the support does drop off when it's framed as a trade-off for car infrastructure. The highest support for increased walk bike investment and initiatives comes from Burlington residents, people of color, and the lowest household income group, although there is that data point around protected bike infrastructure and parking removal that we need to consider. Third, residents understand the importance of walking and biking infrastructure to local business and really rank safety and quality of place highly among commercial street design. And finally, allowing people on bikes to cross intersections on pedestrian signals is broadly supported. All right, I think we've got some questions to get through here.
Yeah, so Jean asks about I believe it was the slide that discussed the relationship between investment and impact to investment into walk bike infrastructure and impact to local businesses. He asks what's the breakdown on the agreement group? And I'm not sure if I fully understand that.
Let's see. It's hard to know. If it was this one, we do have sort of the break. This is the breakdown of the agreement group on the right side here. You said the slide before trade-offs, which was.
Gene has his hand raised, so maybe we can unmute him.
Okay, Gene, should be able to go ahead now.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just the difference between the somewhat and the like fully agree. I think it's on a previous slide that breaks down this 67%. And maybe go back one. Yeah, that no, I mean maybe it's go forward. Two. This one here. So there's a big difference between a somewhat agree and a strongly agree. So I'm just curious about that breakdown. Thank you.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, let's I'll try and pull that up really quick, and Susan, let's grab another question while I'm getting to that.
Let's see here. Stu is suggesting, well, let me jump to your second one, Stu. How do cyclists know that it's legal to use the pedestrian signal in Burlington?
Yeah, they don't. There's definitely a need for education on that. So yeah, we've talked with the city about doing some of that. But yeah, frankly, there is quite a bit of need for some more education there.
And Stu also asks if we collected demographic or city/village where the respondent lives or works.
It is just on where you live, not where you work. So that's when we talk about Burlington residents versus residents in the rest of the county, it's just based on where you live.
Stu, you ask also about number 7. I'm not sure what you're referring to there, but about bike parking, a suggestion that it might be helpful to ask a separate question about the impact or how people feel about having bike parking that's watched and very secure as an option, especially in Burlington. But I guess as a barrier to biking, what the impact of that might be to provide that kind of bike parking opportunity.
Yeah, so let's see, I can, if we're talking about barriers, let's go back. We did not see lack of safe bike parking come up as a strong reason on barriers to biking. We do talk a little bit about that in the e-bike section. It did come up there. Stu, if you were asking about, oops. If you're asking about this question, you know, I think it's sort of just lumped into parking for bikes and the level of importance there, right? We're asking people about their priorities when they're considering the design of a street, and parking for bikes was, you know, a priority for 10% of people.
Yeah, it looks like it was that one, and he was clarifying that maybe it'd be interesting to ask specifically about a particular type of bike parking
Yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah, definitely would be interesting. I would love to get more data just on bike parking specifically. We were, limited in the number of questions we had to work with here, so we tried to keep it kind of high level-ish. So just on Jean's question, which was in regard to this slide, for this one, 26% strongly agreed and 42% somewhat agreed. So that was the breakdown of the agree demographic for this one.
So moving on, Ian commented about the Idaho stop. I see that he has his hand raised, so maybe he would like to share his thoughts about that.
Let's do it. Okay, Ian, go ahead.
Mute, I see. Actually, I pressed the wrong button. I pressed the hand raise when I really meant to make the comment in the chat. So if the comment in the chat is clear, that's what I intended. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So your comment was that a reason to oppose Idaho stop is that all road users should be treated equally. Got it. That's definitely something that I've heard, and I think that there is a strong perception among the population in general that's sort of like same road, same rules. And on the one hand, that's really clear and maybe useful in that regard. In the other hand, the roads and the rules that we've made are really for cars, right? Like people walking, people biking, don't need stoplights except for the fact that there are cars on our roads. And when you ask a person on a bike or a person walking to abide by rules that are really made for infrastructure that's at the scale of a car, you generally make it harder for them to get around. So, it's a very different vehicle. Another, thing to consider is when a person on a bike rolls up to a stop sign, they have a much wider field of peripheral vision than a person in a car. They have use of their hearing. They're generally moving at a slower pace in general, and so have more time to take in their surroundings. They also are the vulnerable user, right? So a person on a bike generally is not going to cause harm to a person in a car if they crash into them. Generally, the person on the bike is the vulnerable user, or the person walking is the vulnerable user. And so there are a lot of reasons why it's pretty safe, and the data backs this up, for a person on a bike to roll through a stop sign when there is no other traffic present. At the moment, the law is to stop at a stop sign, and people should be doing that. But I do think it's something worth thinking about.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Charlie Jones, he's noticing that a takeaway from the presentation so far is that there's a real need for greater awareness raising and education of biking and walking and rolling. And he's wondering if there are funds available for generating video and social media posts that would help create better awareness and understanding.
I don't know about there being funds available. I totally agree that there is a need for more awareness raising, and I think especially when there's a specific thing that we're trying to raise awareness of, like people in Burlington being able to, when they're on a bike, use a pedestrian signal to cross an intersection. I think that's really productive. I think like general education and awareness raising, and like a use your seatbelt, follow the rules kind of thing, I don't see that as being super effective, to be honest. And we do some of that at Local Motion, and I think it's work we're gonna keep doing. But the data pretty strongly says, and experience in other places really pretty strongly says, that if you want more people walking and biking, if you want safer roads, you have to build them to encourage walking and biking and to be safer. And that really means doing the engineering work, building places with destinations close to origins, and making it safe to get around outside of a car and convenient.
Great, thanks. Will Dodge has an interesting question about the protected bike lane responses that we received. He's wondering if respondents, if they were asked about their perspectives related to rebuilding, widening sidewalks to create multi-use off-road paths, if they might be more receptive to that, as it reduces that sort of trade-off with cars issue.
So I think, Will, you specifically mentioned the Route 15 multi-use path, which I think is a great piece of infrastructure, and it didn't require any parking removal or the removal of a travel lane for cars. And I think, yeah, when you can eliminate the trade-off, then the support for building the infrastructure certainly increases. I think there are a lot of contexts where you can't eliminate the trade-off, where there just isn't room in the right of way to have, the travel lanes you have right now or the parking lanes you have right now, and the safe walk bike infrastructure that you want. So, especially in our denser areas, that the trade-off is usually baked in, and it's going to be a political fight to decide whether or not it gets made.
Great. And then Deb Sachs is asking in general about the breakdown in responses, I guess, responses from Burlington versus the entire total number of responses that were received for the survey. I
would have to pull up the cross tabs, but I don't have in front of me right now. Let me see if I can get them really quick. Is there another question, Susan, or was that the last one?
We have two. Well, let's see. Stu, do you have a question? Your hand is raised.
And just real quick, we had 146 responses from Burlington and 442 from the rest of the county. So that was a breakdown there overall. And we will put a link. I'll put the link right now in the chat. And if you go to that link, you can see the crosstab results, which is sort of all the numbers. There's a narrative report, the open-ended responses, everything from the survey is in that folder. Let's keep it moving, so I'm sure you through all of it. Okay, section 3, we're going to talk about e-bikes. So first off, we asked folks, do you own an e-bike? And just so do you own an e-bike, and how interested are you in using an e-bike for transportation purposes? And so what we saw is about a 6% ownership rate overall in the county for e-bikes, and around 39% overall are interested in using an e-bike for transportation. When you look at the youngest age group, people of color, the lowest household income group, those ownership rates go down a bit and the interest rates go up. So looking at the lowest household income group, they have a 3% ownership rate, and 56% of them are interested in using an e-bike for transportation. So a lot of interest out there in e-bikes, especially among the folks that we think of as marginalized groups. Barriers to e-bike use and ownership. This is the full selection. You do see a lack of secure bike parking pop up here. You also see, cost really as the primary barrier far and away. And then distance to destination, as you may know, is still number 2, but it's a much lower percentage compared to when we asked about biking in general. So this gets at Will's point about an e-bike really helping to address those commute distances. So this slide is sort of emphasizing those findings, cost being that number 1 barrier, and it's disproportionately affecting the lowest household income group. They reported it at the highest rate, followed by Burlington residents and the youngest age group. And there's, of course, probably some overlap in those populations. And then lack of secure bike parking we saw was particularly reported by Burlington residents. And then again, that distance to destination difference, it being less of a barrier when it comes to e-bikes. We asked about utility incentives. So are you aware of the e-bike purchase rebate incentives available through Vermont Power Utilities? And what we saw is that around 29% of people know about them, which is pretty good. Unfortunately, only 19% of the lowest household income group know about them. So there's this really interesting pattern here where the lowest household income group has the lowest rate of e-bike ownership, but is the most interested in using them for transportation. Cost is the primary barrier to them getting an e-bike, and they are least aware of the utility incentive that would help them reduce the cost. So certainly a big opportunity there to better promote the incentives that are available. We didn't ask about the state incentive as part of this question because it was brand new when we administered this survey, and so awareness probably would have been really low. I think it's pretty safe to assume that awareness of that incentive is still lower than it is for the utility incentives. So we asked, getting into the controversial issues again, do e-bikes pose a safety concern on shared use paths? And the question was, do you feel that e-bikes pose a safety concern to people walking, biking, or using devices like wheelchairs in shared spaces, such as bike paths? And we saw, a real split on this one, around 30% saying yes, about a quarter saying no, and about half saying no, and about a quarter saying not sure. So, I think this is one to keep an eye on. I think, the number of people that don't have an opinion really reflects that, a lot of people aren't maybe not spending time on bike paths, or just don't have a lot of experience around e-bikes. But with 30% of people saying yes, I think this is something for us to pay attention to. Municipalities like Burlington have been working to address this with etiquette and education campaigns. People on regular bikes can go just as fast as a person on an e-bike. They can make close passes just like a person on an e-bike. So I think that's likely an approach that makes sense. But longer term, I think it's definitely worth thinking about, if we really should be mixing, in particular, people walking and people on e-bikes and electric cargo bikes and those sorts of things on paths. And, we may just need to build more good bike infrastructure, more good walk infrastructure. So the key points for the e-bike section, that was a quick one. The countywide ownership rate is around 6%. Younger people of color, those with lower household incomes are really most interested in using e-bikes for transportation. Cost is identified as the top barrier to e-bike ownership, and low-income residents are the least aware of those utility incentives. And e-bikes appear to reduce the significance of distance to destination as a barrier to biking. And that is the end of the presentation. I put the link in the chat where you can find all the survey data set and the report and these slides. And let's go back to the questions and comments. We got about 5 minutes left here.
So, yeah, I was going to say, John Riley is asking what utilities offer incentives. I'm going to share a link to that. I know Green Mountain Power is one, Burlington Electric. Here's a link to Drive Electric Vermont that should have the full list.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Susan.
Deb is suggesting that slide 30 might be shared with legislators to reduce the complexity on distribution of rebates.
Yeah, we I can't remember if we shared this with legislators last year, but we certainly will share it again. I think overall this data on e-bikes is really important to share, not just about the awareness of incentives, but the interest level and the groups that are interested. I think it's pretty instructive and really positive. So we will definitely be sharing this with legislators. They did, V-Trans and legislators did make an effort in this last session to make the rebates more focused on lower income residents. They did increase the rebate amounts and lower the income threshold. So, we would like to see there be more money overall available for e-bikes for all populations, and for, in particular, the incentives for the lower income folks to be much higher than they are now. So that's definitely something we're going to be advocating for in this coming session.
Great. And Will, was also kind of raising the awareness question around the e-bike incentives that the utility could maybe do a better job by putting that information in some postcards or otherwise outreach to the community. I'm not sure if that's something that they're doing now or not.
Yeah, I don't know if that's being done. It is something that we're going to be talking with utilities about.
And then Stu, one last comment from Stu. He's just suggesting that adding a slide on the demographics of respondents might help folks kind of better interpret the data. But otherwise, great presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. And yeah, we certainly can add that. And if you look at the crosstabs spreadsheet that has all the demographic breakdown, to be clear though, the demographics of this survey are basically as close as possible to the demographics of the county. That's what makes it statistically representative. So that's it. Unless there are other questions out there, we will we'll close it out. Susan's going to put some links in the chat to some resources that we've got going. I want to emphasize we do have a whole series of webinars planned for this fall, winter, and early spring. That's really intended to help local advocates understand, how they can make change in their communities. What are some things to focus on? Understand the resources and programs that are out there. So I encourage you to sign up for those webinars. This was recorded, so you'll also get a link to the recording. And there are a few other links that Susan's going to put in the chat, I think, to our statewide Walk Bike Advocates Forum and our technical assistance page, which, Susan and I are really available to local advocates and local groups to help you make change in your communities. That's what we're here for. So don't hesitate to reach out. And yeah, you'll get an email with some follow-up info and links. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and look forward to talking with you soon.